You're a mess.
I know, dude. Oh my God, dude. So I had a meeting. I've had meetings like all day. Like today has been like an insanely busy day, like work meetings and stuff. I just finished up a meeting at like 11:30. So I was trying to get lunch. I'll just make a quick smoothie. I put the lid on, but I guess I didn't put it on tight enough, dude. And like it just like all over the place. I'm a mess. It's been like that all day. It's just nothing new, man.
Well, I said you were a mess, but literally you were a mess. You were making a mess with your smoothie, yeah.
I am literally a mess, man. I probably have like blueberries and stuff on my shirt. It's a goddamn mess.
Well, blueberries are a superfood. I'm sure it's good for something.
I know, yeah. I just like in the middle of me, I get hungry. I'll just suck on my shirt or something. All right, let's do it. What's up, UX fam? How's your mom and them? Welcome to another episode of Beyond UX Design. I'm Jeremy. If you're new here, welcome to the show. I am super stoked to have you. And if you haven't done it already, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you are regular here and you feel like you're getting something out of the show, I would really appreciate you leaving a 5-star review. That'll help me out so much more than you can imagine. This week's audiobook recommendation is The Science of Storytelling by William Storr. And this book explores some of the psychological and evolutionary aspects of storytelling, and it digs into how stories help shape a lot of our beliefs, how we identify with groups, and how we understand the world. And you should definitely check this out, especially today, because I've got a guest that we're going to talk about in a second. We're going to talk all about storytelling, so that audiobook is fitting. So head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/audible trial to start your free trial and download The Science of Storytelling completely free and help support the show in the process. And as always, thanks so much to Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, and Kevin for all their support. And if you want to join these fine folks and help keep the show independent and ad-free, you can become a patron for as little as $3 a month. That's less than $1 an episode. And if you do that, you'll get some sweet, sweet perks for your support. And of course, if you think the show is worth sharing, then I would love it if you told some friends. So I mentioned I've got a guest. We're going to talk about storytelling. I've got Jeff White on again. Jeff White, second time on the show. Jeff, you were my first guest, and you are now my first repeat guest. So I hope that makes you feel somewhat special. I am really excited to talk to Jeff. Jeff is a UX designer and entrepreneur with more than 2 decades of design experience. He's worked with companies ranging from Fortune 100 tech giants to tiny startups being run from a garage. Jeff spent the first half of his career as a full-time employee at Amazon and 2 other companies before going out on his own as an entrepreneur, co-founding a startup, and then starting Stepladder, a UX and visual design firm. Jeff writes on LinkedIn and shares resources that help designers advance their career with storytelling, which is why we got you on today. So Jeff, welcome back to the show. Hey. First time repeat guest. How's it going, man?
It's going great. I don't have the words to express how honored and humbled I am to be your first guest and your first repeat guest. So thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Of course, man. So you have been since we've talked last, you've been doing some really awesome stuff on LinkedIn. You started a UX storytelling course, newsletter. You've got a little ebook that you wrote. And I am just so excited to get some of these ideas out to all of my listeners because I think what you're doing is amazing. So we're going to go over some of this stuff today, man. We talked a little bit about your bio last time. So if you want to go back and listen to a little bit about how Jeff got in the industry, go back and listen to, was it episode 10? 9, 10, 11, something like that, where we talked about Jeff. So we don't need to bore you with all that stuff again. I imagine your bio, your background hasn't changed that much.
It has not changed. It hasn't changed, luckily. So we're all good.
Right on, man. So storytelling. So we didn't really touch on storytelling last time. We were kind of debating the whole UX UI thing. So let's talk a little bit about storytelling this time. I'm curious from your perspective, what happened in your career that just sort of was, you're just like, ding, something went off in your head and you realized like storytelling was so important.
Yeah, I think it took a little while for me to really understand how important it was. I think I started piecing it together in my first job, which was at this healthcare company. This was way, way back, where we had to do a lot of evangelizing what user-centered design was and how the company could help it be more successful. And I started understanding that the way you talk to people, stakeholders, really anyone in life, but especially stakeholders at work, makes all the difference in getting buy-in and consensus around whatever, ideas, designs, whatever it could be. So I started understanding it a little bit pretty early in my career, but I think it really, truly hit home in a big way in my first kind of big design presentation when I was working at Amazon. And I had put tons of work into this document I was presenting to a room full of people, many of them way, way, way above my pay grade, right? Like I was out of my element for sure. And I just kind of launched into my plan, like walking through these designs. And it seemed like immediately the whole meeting, the conversation, the narrative, and everything was taken over by other people. And I was just shell shocked, really.
Yeah.
I'm just like, what is happening? Like they don't understand. And it was a difficult experience for me. It was challenging. It was kind of the first time I'd had an experience like that. And I'd been a designer for a while. This was, 5 or 6 years into my career. And I realized, wow, I've really got to pay attention to how I speak to certain types of people, how I present my work, what I talk about, when I don't talk about. And that's when it really, really hit home. That I needed to start paying attention to this stuff in a real way.
Was Jeff Bezos in that meeting by any chance?
He was not. No.
Oh, okay.
No, he was not, luckily.
Oh, man.
No, he wasn't in there, but there were some executives. There were like executives, directors, managers, and little old me suffering through the next 60 minutes of that meeting. But
oh, man. Well, I'm curious, what was the outcome of that meeting? Did you get what you wanted, or was it completely the opposite outcome?
I don't remember what the specific outcome was. I know that, as is the case with many designers out there who are doing a lot of presentations to any stakeholders, but especially senior stakeholders, it can be you go in for number one, and then there's a bunch of feedback, things happen, and you go back the next week or 2 weeks after that for number two. And it's been my experience that is common. It can be challenging, but we can treat it like everything else and learn from our experiences and use that to make the next one better. So
you went in there, you weren't a junior designer. You mentioned you were 6 years in at that point. A lot of junior designers, even senior designers, what do they get wrong when they think about storytelling? Because you hear that advice all the time. Oh, you got to tell compelling stories. UX designers tell stories. When you hear that, you think of, once upon a time, Jack and Jill went up a hill. But what do you think people get wrong about storytelling?
Well, I think that just the foundational element is, this isn't so much something people get wrong, but the first step is understanding just how much it matters. And I think that, especially early on in our careers and coming out of whatever kind of education we have, we're really into the craft of it. Like the creative process of making stuff and designing stuff. And then it's not until a little bit later that we start having sometimes hard realizations like I did that, there's a bunch of other stuff that matters just as much as that, right? So step one is just understanding that it matters. I think once we're aware that it's a thing that we need to be practicing and doing well, the biggest mistakes that I see are describing the UI. If someone's designing something that has a UI, and we don't really understand how to tell a story around it and communicate it to people in an effective way. I used to do this. I see a lot of other designers do this, and I work with designers on how to not do this, but they really just describe the UI. So they start going, I've got this component at the top, and then I have this other component, and then I have our button, and then so on and so forth. And that's a classic mistake that people make when presenting work. I think that that's a symptom of a larger mistake, which is not focusing on why.
Why, yeah.
And this is a big thing. It's good to talk about. It's mysterious and it's kind of nebulous, and it's hard to pin down what it really means and how you do it. But focusing on why is really the secret to presenting work, talking to people, storytelling, all that stuff. The way that I think about it is, what is the why? If I'm presenting work to a stakeholder, it's why is this design a good design? Or if we're looking at different options, why is it better than some others? Why is something we're doing bad? And that always involves getting back to, what is the business trying to do? What problems, pains, struggles do users have? What technology considerations are at work? And then really articulating why the design is going to do stuff for the business, is going to help users, and then be harmonious with tech constraints as well.
And it's crazy you mentioned. I'm glad you mentioned this first, because this is really interesting. But a couple of weeks back, I had an episode where we talked about part of the problem with UX education, and a lot of the stuff is just this process-driven, almost productizing UX education. This is the same thing. Just learn these steps and you'll be a great UX designer. And very rarely is that why piece ever taught. Is that business consideration ever taught? Is the technical constraints ever something that people are taught to consider? And it's not surprising that this is something it takes some people a while to learn, Because no one tells them about it when they're in school, and they don't learn it until they get in a room like you did and fail miserably and have to learn on their own, which is so sad. But it's just kind of one of those things like you're never taught that stuff, which blows my mind, to be honest. But
it's true. And, I think about that a lot. And I wonder, like, one, you're right. It does feel sad that it's not taught. Another part of me wonders why it's not taught. And I think a part of it is there's so much about our job and our profession that you just got to get out there and put your feet on the street to learn. You can't really learn in a classroom. I think that is a factor with this, especially. But I'm sure you're right that at the very least, we can be doing a better job educating younger designers that, hey, it's not just the hard skills and fundamental skills you need. There's this whole other area of growth. And it's okay it's necessary to focus on the fundamentals at first. But at some point, you got to grapple with these other things. And storytelling is certainly one of them.
Well, that's what we're doing here today, Jeff. So
we are.
That's why we're here. That's why we're here. So that's something I really do. Again, why I wanted to have you on, because again, this is stuff that people don't. If they happen to come across your post on LinkedIn, they might find this stuff, and other people who are other people are talking about it, obviously. But you've got the course and you've got the guidebook and stuff that I think are just super helpful. One of the things that I really loved that you posted a couple months ago, you started talking about different methods, different storytelling methods. Can you speak a little bit to some of those methods and how, again, when we think about storytelling, a lot of people think once upon a time there was Jim and Jim did this, blah, blah, blah. But that's maybe one way to tell a story. But there's tons of other ways that are really impactful. Can you talk about some of those and just, maybe an example, or I don't know, just a couple things?
Sure. And I know you're dying to bring up the story spine, and you're gonna bring up the quote about sailing and loving the ocean. I'm good.
I like it to help set a frame of reference for your people who you're building stuff for. But I don't like to use, that's not something I would ever use in a meeting, right? Like we can talk about the stories fine, but I really like your approach. I know one of the things you mentioned specifically is like in media res, right? And kind of starting in the beginning or starting when the actions already started. So anyway, we could talk about stories fine, but that's kind of one of the things I like to just get our team to understand what we're building for. But that's just one method though. That's just one reason why you would tell a story. That's not something you would tell in like a stakeholder meeting or something. So anyway.
Yeah, that's right. It's a good point. So and you alluded to this earlier where people hear the word storytelling. Just as a quick backtrack, I think one of the challenging things about storytelling is it's another one of those terms in our profession that means 10 different things to 10 different people. Sure. It's everywhere. It's in every profession. So there's a lot of different perceptions about what it means. And that's one of the things that makes it kind of hard to talk about. But anyway, we tend to think of like Pixar and Hollywood and fiction and novels and all this stuff when we hear the word storytelling. There are tons of different frameworks. You mentioned in medias res, which just means start in the middle or at the end instead of at the beginning. There's tons of others. There's the story spine that we talked about. There's Pixar's 22 rules of storytelling. There's a really popular Medium post written a few years ago by, I believe, a product manager about this. There's framework upon framework upon framework. And the thing I would say about frameworks in general is they can be helpful. It's a helpful way of thinking about things and maybe communicating to other people. But frameworks aren't coming to save us.
Yeah, that's a good point.
At the end of the day, it's like, when's the last time you saw a crappy movie? Who's ever seen a crappy movie or read a bad book? Storytelling frameworks are underlying each and every one of those. So frameworks are great, but they're not really enough. And I think also to your point, the different frameworks apply to different situations. If you are a design strategist working at the very beginning of a 0 to 1 project, and nobody really knows what we're doing yet, you're just out there like on a fishing expedition to see what problems exist and what customers may need. The way you might capture your research findings is by using the story spine and telling a real narrative, a traditional story about someone's life and what problems they have and what opportunities exist to help them and transform their life in some way. That's a real traditional story, right? And you're also right that in day-to-day UX work, that stuff isn't relevant most of the time. I think that more practical, pragmatic, efficient ways of using narrative when we communicate with all the different people we communicate with are needed. And it's hard to find real examples of that stuff. there are some good resources out there, but not a lot. Certainly not as many as learning Figma, learning UI design, some of those other things that are out there. So,
well, do you have like maybe, I don't know, in your head at least, and do you have any examples of when you may use some of these different methods and when they might be applicable? And then, you mentioned, story spine and talking to users day to day or talking about your work day to day probably isn't going to be helpful. Are there other examples where you might say, well, if you're approaching this situation, there's this method. If you're trying this thing, you could try this thing, or, frameworks. I know we said frameworks probably aren't the best, but is there something in your head where you found like telling a story in a certain way works in this setting or environment? Or is it like everything else? It depends.
Yeah, it does depend. In my experience, even if you're working within the same company, if you're communicating to different people within that company, it depends on who you're speaking with or who you're working with. A lot of day-to-day work for me still to this day, and I know a lot of other designers out there, is like jamming with the PM and maybe an engineering lead or another designer you're working with every day. The way I think about it is I'm always storytelling when I'm communicating with those people, but it's not the full story because they already know most of it, right? It wouldn't make sense to tell the full story of the project you're working on when you just met with this person and worked on this problem yesterday or last week. But the story that is relevant is it's always a matter of basic context, and you can still focus on the why when you're just having quick working sessions with people. And really, then the story is usually I start with, here's a quick reminder of what we're trying to do. Here's like a quick status update of what happened last time and why we're meeting and working on this today. And then I typically will present design. It might be one design, it might be a few different options, just depending on what's going on. But it always comes back to bringing it back to the why.
Right.
Here's why we're looking at this design today. Here's why this design might be a good idea for us. Here's some of the pros and cons of this versus some of the other options we have in front of us. And always moving the conversation forward by mapping it back to, quote, the why.
And the kind of way I sort of think about it too is, to me, storytelling is really speaking in a sort of compelling manner. Like your goal is to sort of have someone feel something at the end or influence them in some way and have them come to some consensus or agreement or change their mind or whatever it is. And your job is to compel them to get there, right? So thinking about that, and when you think about frameworks, like it's all about context. It's all about the people in the room and what they already know or don't know, and what they might need to know to help them make a better decision. And as I sort of think about that, like, I don't know if that's the right way to explain it, but it's really like explaining your work in a compelling way, using the why maybe, or if somebody already understands why, maybe there's some other way to speak compellingly.
Yeah.
But it's about getting them it's about influence. It's about changing minds, it's about inspiring. It's about changing the mood of the room or something, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Convincing them in some way. And, I think that's, if when you say it that way, it's a lot different than, once upon a time there was a user and he had, so it kind of helps, I think, to explain that. I don't know if that's the right way to do it, but that's how I've always thought of it. I'm curious if that makes sense to you. I don't know.
I think so. Yeah, you're right. Speaking in a compelling way that motivates people and influences people. I use the words influence and convince a lot, and that can feel creepy to people sometimes, which is understandable. But the reality is that's that's what we do. That's what everybody is doing. We're trying to influence and get to some sort of outcome and work with other people to do that. But I think you're right that there are certain techniques we can use to get an emotional response from people. What I found, the way I think about it, you nailed it, that it's always about some sort of context. And then after that, the things that get people to have emotional reactions are typically stuff like struggles and transformations. And those are kind of the three, like, despite all the different storytelling frameworks you can go out and find, I think every single one of them has those three things in common. There's some sort of backstory and context. There's some sort of struggle. Sometimes it's an existential crisis. It can be action, adventure, triumph, all that stuff. It all sounds very heady, but we can use this stuff when we communicate in very basic ways with a stakeholder, where it's, if it's something like you're looking at a current product experience and doing an audit of it. If you can just give a quick reminder, even if your stakeholder knows customers really well, knows the full story of what you're doing, just dropping quick reminders about who the user is and like some of the struggles they face on a day-to-day basis, and then showing how the current product makes those struggles more difficult, and just kind of bringing that pain to the surface, and then delivering the transformation too. This is where designers have a superpower. We can help them understand that context and the problem, the struggle, and then we can show them with our craft the transformation. Like, here's a better way, or here's two better ways. Let's have a discussion around this and figure out how to move forward. So I think hopefully that's a more kind of a pragmatic and tactical way to incorporate storytelling into just basic conversations or daily design reviews or jam sessions with people.
Yeah. And you know what? I'm just thinking about this too, kind of thinking out loud. But if I look back on the times when I've seen designers fail in meetings and not get people to, not get their way or get a different outcome than they expect or whatever it is, it generally goes back to them just assuming that everyone knows what they're talking about, right? And when you use the audit as an example, right? Talking about how the situation is bad or the current product is bad and acting as if everyone just knows that that's bad, right? And saying, well, clearly this is bad. Look what we've done here. We've got this weird thing and the colors are off and it's not accessible and no one can read it and the button's too small, so it's bad, right? It's not about just talking about it as if everyone's agree, oh, well, of course it's bad. It's, why is that bad? How does that color scheme hurt the problem? How does this, not having the system status displaying, whatever the heuristics you're using for your audit, how does that actually hurt the product? Instead of just saying, well, it's bad, telling it in a different way. This is like this, and this leads to this outcome, which is bad. And therefore we've got these ideas that we can make and improve it and improve the outcome. And I think that's the kind of thing too, I think about is just these designers, we often assume, and this is, I say this a lot, but I feel like designers have this sort of, what's the right word? Like we have a big head, right? We self-aggrandize, like we're the most important people on the team and everyone should listen to us. And how could you not listen to us? We're the designer, and when you go in the meetings and you approach them that way and you just give those sort of matter-of-fact statements, this is bad, we have a better idea, it doesn't ever tend to work. And using these techniques, explaining that why, like you said, is something that I feel is just such an important thing. It's just, and people come to their own conclusions when you tell them that why, and they're like, oh yeah, of course that's bad.
Yeah.
Of course that's bad. And you don't have to convince them. They come to it on their own. They come up with it on their own in their own head.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Anyway, so I love that. So when we think about storytelling, a lot of times one of the things I hear all the time people say is, your case studies, your portfolio should tell a story. So I'm curious in your perspective, can we maybe compare and contrast a case study that does a really bad job? This is a fictional case study, obviously, that does a really bad job of conveying the work, and one that might use storytelling in a way that conveys the work in a much better, more effective way.
Totally. I think first, like maybe a small caveat or context to this. I'm totally cognizant of the amount of advice out there about case studies and conflicting, especially conflicting advice about case studies. I know I work with a lot of designers working on their case studies, and I know how challenging it is. I just want to take a minute and say there are designers out there getting hired with a number of different types of storytelling, or sometimes no storytelling at all in their online portfolios. And the most important thing is, if your online portfolio and your case studies are getting you the results that you want, then it's good. Yeah. Despite whatever advice, despite whatever I'm about to say or whatever you're about to say. So I just kind of want to take a second and acknowledge that, because
thank you for doing that.
Man, there really is a ton of conflicting advice out there on case studies, and it's one of the more difficult things that we do, I think. So, but to get back to your question, so yes, I think that a general template for a case study that I see a lot is the process-oriented case study. Generally, it starts with a problem statement, and then I did this deliverable, and then they show the deliverable, and then I did this deliverable next, and on down the line. And it's very long. It's really a list of a bunch of different deliverables. And it's kind of like your completed to-do list with supporting visuals. That's one kind of case study I think is very prominent. I think if you want to think about, one simple way to apply storytelling to the same thing is to start connecting the dots between those different deliverables with what the situation was and why you decided to create that next deliverable. Like why that, why whatever it is, why a persona, why a wireframe, why a high fidelity prototype or whatever the thing is. And then talk about what insights you got from doing that and how that led to the next thing. So that's an example of telling the story of like, okay, here's what was going on. Here's why we did this. Here's what happened. And that influenced what we did next. And then that's the story. That's the why. If a designer chooses to have a more narrative-based case study, that's a way you can make it more compelling and insightful for whoever's reading it and incorporate storytelling into it.
Now, one of the things that, if I remember correctly, when you posted about this on LinkedIn, I thought this was really interesting, fascinating, was using some of those different techniques that we talked about, the frameworks, and you could apply some of those if it calls for it in your case study. And one of the, if I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned the in media res one, where you could start off in the middle, like, or the end, like, here's the outcome, here's what we got. And let me tell you how we got there, Yeah. So I don't know, could you talk about that? Like, are there other ways that you think, like some concepts or examples or something that you've seen that work really well? Keep in mind the context. Some people it might work for them, might not work for you.
Yeah.
But any examples you have that you think are like, man, I saw this one and it did this and it was really cool.
So you mentioned in medias res, that's starting at the end. I personally review a lot of portfolios and do a lot of hiring and portfolio reviews and stuff like that. I love when people do this, when people start at the end. And it doesn't have to be super complicated. A great way, if you have some sort of outcome that you were aware of and can publicly share, like an increase in some sort of metric, that is a great way to start at the end. And a lot of design agencies do this, where if you go to an agency website and read a case study, it's increasing whatever metric, increasing cart conversions by 86%.
And that's the title.
That's the title.
Like right up at the top, right?
Yes, that makes I was about to say that makes anybody want to read it. Of course, I'm sure some people will not want to read it, but that's super compelling. And I don't have to read a lengthy process or story to figure out what happened. I just, in 5 seconds, I go, wow, these guys got this outcome for this company. That is interesting. And we can do the same thing in our case studies if we have data like that. That's a great way to do it. Another way to do it is to just show a finished visual at the very front, at the very top. This was, what it ended up looking like. If it was a redesign, you can do a before and after. Those can be really powerful ways to start at the end. And then you kind of get into, now that your reader is hooked and intrigued by what you can do, now maybe they want to know more about how you did that. They're thinking about sending you an email, which is exactly what you want your case study or online portfolio to do.
One of the things too this is something I see quite a bit too, is this process-driven case study. A lot of times it tend to be people that are just out of school. And a lot of times those process-driven case studies are just made up prompts. They got the prompt from their class, their instructors gave everybody the same prompt, or maybe, I know there's some boot camps where they kind of customize the prompt to the person, but generally speaking, it's, here's a prompt made up, there's no outcome, right?
Yeah.
And so in that case, one of the things that I like to tell people there is tell the story, not about the work, but about you and how you got something out of this. Maybe you have 2 case studies. Maybe you have a case study about the work, but you could also have a case study about what you learned, and then talk about, like, the heading, instead of talking about the outcome was, what did I learn? I learned that this was wrong, or this was good, or this was bad, or I learned how to do a different thing. And that's an interesting thing. That's something like most people don't ever put in their case study, and it's funny because a lot of people just assume, well, my case study has to be about the work. Like, the case study could literally be about anything, right? I mean, the whole point is to just prove to a hiring manager that you can do the work. How you do that doesn't matter. There's no standard, right, for case studies. So that's another thing too, is like the outcome, like, doesn't have to be the outcome of the project or the product.
Yeah.
The outcome could be you changed your mind. You had a different way of thinking about stuff. So anyway, I love that idea. I don't know. That's just something I've been like telling people recently, is like, you don't like the prompt, talk about what you learned, what you got out of it, as opposed to just the work itself,
Yeah. That's I think that's really interesting. And it's it kind of brings up another idea, which is, we talked a little earlier about how people are drawn to struggles and the stories about how people overcome them. This is another thing that designers can think about leaning into when they are telling the story of their work. This is relevant for online case studies. It's an option of how to do storytelling. It's also super relevant for private portfolio presentations and interview loops. But you can lean into what was challenging about it. and really kind of tell that story and say, this was a challenge. The key is you have to finish it with the transformation, right?
Right.
This is the challenge
yeah.
that I really struggled with this, or this was difficult, whatever it is. And here's what I did next. And here's what happened. Your point about not having outcomes is a great one, because that happens in so many different situations. It could be if you're just working in a prompt in your boot camp or design school, or it could be you're a consultant or freelancer and you're just gone by the time something actually gets launched.
Yeah,
There's all sorts of reasons where we're just not around to know what the outcome is, or if we are, you're under an NDA and you can't share it anyway. So finding other ways and other methods for telling the story is good.
It's really sad, funny, sad, disappointing, realistic. I don't even know how to describe this, but I work at this giant corporation, and we work on projects for years at a time.
Yeah.
And a lot of them end up, maybe our developers work in an agile kind of sprint by sprint basis, but these projects tend to be waterfall. And so a lot of cases you might work on a project for 2 years and they scrap it. They just defund it and it's gone and it was never released. Or you work on a project for a year and then you get moved to another project, and you never finished it. You only worked on one little small part of it. So a lot of times, even if you work in a big company like that, you might never have an outcome. You might never get to the point. You might work on one tiny little piece of a very large thing.
Yeah.
So that piece about what did you learn? What came out of it? I think that's like an interesting thing just in general, to think about if you're, doing your case studies. So a lot of times people that work in these big enterprise internal teams have a really hard time coming up with case studies, because a lot of the stuff is one, NDA, but two, might never get released. I worked on something it was 4 years, and they ended up just cutting it and never got released. Never got released.
That's a long time. That's a lot of life to put into something.
It's a lot of life. It helped inspire this podcast to do other things, to be honest. Well, you know what? This is there's more to life than this one thing.
But you're not wrong.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, COVID kind of screwed that all up, but that didn't happen for a lot of people, so I can't really complain. All right, sorry for the interruption in the middle of the interview, but it is time for a mid-roll sponsor break. Let's hear it from our sponsor this week, Wix Studio. Web designers, let's talk about the C word, creative burnout. Your client site has real portfolio potential, but between resourcing, feedback, tight budgets, and even tighter deadlines, it just doesn't make the cut. Wix Studio helps close that gap. Built for agencies and enterprises, you can bring your vision to life and keep it alive. With no-code animations, tons of AI tools, reusable design assets, and advanced layout tools. For your next project, check out Wix Studio at beyonduxdesign.com/Wix. That's beyonduxdesign.com/Wix. And now back to the show. But so the other thing too is thinking about, again, the story spine. One of the things that I tell people, and again, not to say just do the story spine, but thinking about the personas. Right? And a character, right? Everybody loves a character. And you mentioned this underdog story. One of the things I've seen too in countless case studies is they present this persona and they never mention it again, right? Like Kelly, the blah, blah, blah. It's like, why do we care about Kelly? Why? What problem did Kelly have? And then talk about, they never mention Kelly again. And one of the things I always like to think about is if you've done a persona and you've come up with something, use that as like the opening. Like, let me tell you about Kelly. Kelly's got this real bad problem and she's constantly struggling with this thing. Let me show you what we did to fix it, but reinforcing every time, like now Kelly can do this. And now Kelly can, get her Starbucks or whatever in her SUV or whatever your persona says, you know what I mean? But I don't know, I'm curious, is that something you've seen work in the past where people kind of reinforce that idea of a character and, or does that generally not work? I'm curious because that's kind of an idea I have, but I don't know that I've ever really seen it before. So I'm curious what you think.
I've never done it in exactly the way you're talking about. I have seen other designers say exactly what you're saying and report that it's been effective. I think it all comes down to your personal style and the context. The way that I've referred back to personas has been more in like very surgical, brief ways when it's needed. And I've used it before, like you're reviewing some design with the PM or other stakeholders, whoever it is. Inevitably, the conversation is going to go something like this. It's going to be like, yeah, but that's really hard to do and we don't have much time. So what about this other thing? And if it feels like something that you need to push back on, then just doing a quick reminder about about the persona and the context and what we're trying to do can be an effective way to get somebody to go, yes, maybe I shouldn't be thinking about another aspect of this decision besides just the cost and time to market. Like little quick reminders, like remember whoever the persona is, remember what they're trying to do. And if we go down this path, that's going to get harder. That's going to affect our conversion. See if you can map it back to a business goal. Are we sure we're okay with that to save a week or two? Sometimes that's an effective way to quickly bring up a persona and then map it back to goals, other considerations, and try to influence the decision if you need to.
Yeah, a couple months ago, I interviewed Radu Vucha, and we talked about, the idea of stop saying user. And then obviously that begs the question, well, what do you say instead, Yeah. And one of the things that and I've been thinking about since then is, instead of just saying users, right? Well, our users when you have these conversations, instead of just saying user, because user is this nebulous thing, especially if you're a big product with multiple users that might be doing different things. You might have this type of user or that type of user, and they all have different things. So, talking about that persona or whatever, use the username or the type, whatever, the administrator or this or that, but using that and like personifying that thing, that user, that human, and talking about that in that way in these meetings, instead of just saying, well, users like to do this. Well, like users like to do this, but what about, Radu mentioned like content creators versus content consumers, two very different pieces of probably the same product, right?
Yeah.
Content creators really need this thing. And using that as like a way to reinforce the thing that you're saying to be more compelling versus just users. Because it's just, users. What does user mean? I don't know. Totally depends what user we're talking about.
Yeah.
So reusing that and plugging that in, whether you have a persona or Jim or Jeff or Kelly or whatever you want to call them, having that as your sort of character, your underdog, as you're talking about some of these things to be more compelling and sort of, you mentioned, what word was it used before, but the sort of gut feeling, like getting that feeling in your gut where you want to, you feel bad for them or something, Well,
yeah. And I love that you brought this up. I just listened to that episode with you and Radu yesterday.
Oh, right on.
I was driving around the car and I kind of catching up on your podcast because we were doing this talk today. And I listened to it and it was great. I've interacted a little bit with Radu on LinkedIn. And the thing I love about your podcast and other podcasts is you just get to meet these people that you kind of interact with on a website or in your app.
Sure, yeah.
And so it was just great to hear the two of you talk. And I'm kind of laughing and smiling because I was with you in your struggle to not say the word user in that episode, which I think you did a few times. You're like,
absolutely,
oh crap, I'm doing it again.
Yeah, keep doing it.
And I really liked your guys' suggestion to use AI to like create a buzzing sound whenever someone says the word user. That was really creative. So it was, anyway, it was a good episode. But, okay, my mind has wandered. We were talking about, your question was, have I seen it be effective to not use the word user?
Or either way, yeah. Or if it makes it, I'm curious if you've seen success stories or, somebody like that's kind of
I don't have anything specific
like
around that. It's something I try to do as much as I can. I say the word user all the time. It does feel better. I don't have any data saying it's more effective if I say content creator versus user. So I can't truly say, but it certainly feels right, doesn't it? It feels more specific and relatable when you go content creator versus user, which is much colder, robotic, and non-specific. So
yeah, in one of the tools that I'm working on at work, we've got something like 10,000, 5 to 10,000, it's a lot of users. But it could literally be anything, and so we've got, tons and tons of these little micro apps, features all throughout this application that we're building. And every one of them could be doing something different and how they interact with one tool and another tool. So I've found over time that, explicitly saying something like power plant engineer versus material buyer versus field service engineer, these various roles almost, they're all doing different things. They're interacting with the features, yes, but they might take it and go to a completely different tool afterwards. And there's a process, and so for me, at least, talking about that and talking about how they use this thing, because somebody say, well, they need to go download this thing and that's it. I'm like, well, they need to download this thing, but after that, they're going to this other thing over here. So why isn't this feature incorporated with that thing? Why do I have to come out of the tool, go to this thing, to go back to this other tool to do another task? So it makes that story a lot easier to tell. when I'm trying to convince someone that the way they're thinking about doing it is wrong. And so, if I just said users, it's hard to convince someone that, well, yeah, they got to download that thing. But what if they didn't ever have to leave that tool to download it here? What if they stayed in that other tool the whole time? Which is kind of interesting because in my job, as an architect, it's really more like service designer. So it's like thinking about the system and connecting dots and all that stuff. So I'm having a lot different conversations than like a product designer would have when they say, well, the button needs to be on the right and it should be this color and this pixel radius or whatever, right? So it's very different. And again, it goes back to that idea of context and why you're even having this conversation, right? How I talk about some of these things are totally different than how a product designer might talk about it because they're trying to convince someone of something completely different. Yeah. So anyway, you're going back to your point about context and stuff. It's kind of fascinating there.
Yeah. And I think even in the situation you just brought up around buttons and UI, that side of product design, you can still map it back to the stuff you're talking about. Who's the human? What are they trying to do? How does this affect that situation? So I think it's applicable in a number of different situations and roles and et cetera.
All right. So we talked about case studies and case studies being on your actual website, something where a human's going to go find your website or resume, click on the button, open this page. But then you've got a different scenario where you have to talk about your work in an interview. So I'm curious from your perspective, when someone says, the really first thing they say is, tell me about yourself. And the next one is, walk me through some of your work. How might we use different storytelling techniques in that environment where I'm actually speaking and talking to a person to tell that story about the work? Would you use different techniques there when you're actually got them live or versus reading? Or what are your thoughts there? What are the differences, nuances, compare and contrast? I don't know.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is the visual layer of the presentation. I think the underlying narrative and like if you're using a storytelling framework, it can be the same online as your private portfolio presentation. But I think a best practice for those is really a big difference in how the visuals are presented. And the biggest difference is on your website, if you're doing like a long narrative case study style, there's a lot of words. Your visual in-person presentation should get rid of most of those words. And you're verbally telling your compelling story with the right kind of visuals that are backing it up. If you are finding yourself looking at a slide with a lot of text on it and you find yourself reading the text, that is the key sign that the storytelling is off, particularly for the in-person portfolio presentation. So I always describe it as more of like, think about the last TED Talk you watched or attended. Think about the style of some of those like really fantastic storytellers and presenters are doing. If there is a slide with some bullets and text on it, it's super minimal, but it's mostly about these kind of immersive visuals that back up what you're saying. I think that's the biggest difference. All the other things are, at least to me, are pretty much the same in terms of what style of storytelling you can use and connecting the dots, talking about challenges if you want to lean into that. That's all pretty similar. I think the visual piece is the big difference.
I don't like to give a lot of blanket advice because I think, it depends quite a bit.
Yeah.
But if I could give blanket advice to anybody is create a deck when you present your work in an interview. Do not present from your website. That's like what that looks like and how you talk about it might change and there might be context there. But please do not present from your website. Don't pull up, share your screen, scroll through your webpage and try to present from that way. I think that's blanket advice.
That's a great call out. It's something that I see happen pretty frequently.
All the time,
and I think that it definitely does not make a good impression when in your interview. Yeah, that and just the other best practices around. I think the thing is with the in-person presentation, that's really your chance to control the message and deliver the message that you really want. You're never going to have more control over anything than your in-person portfolio presentation. And you still don't have control over everything, but that's where you think about best practices for designing slides. Have something that's focused. Don't meander through a lot of text and things that the hiring team has already seen.
All right. So the last kind of big one, I mean, there's a lot of scenarios where you could tell stories, obviously, but the last big one is this idea of the stakeholder meeting, the one that you kind of talked about where you failed miserably. Thinking about stakeholder meetings, definitely different. You're not, you've got to set up context in these other examples we talked about because the people that looking have no idea. They don't know anything about it. Stakeholders different. They're part of the process. Maybe they're part of the thing. So Tell me about stakeholder. How do you approach stakeholder meetings and telling compelling stories? And how would you make sure that is a success?
This is great. There's one key ingredient to all of this we haven't brought up yet that's important in this and any other situation, but that's audience insight / know the audience. That is the key to, and even going back to online case studies and portfolio presentations. But let's talk about stakeholder meetings. It is all about understanding who you're talking to. This can be challenging because sometimes you've never talked to that person before. And so you don't have any history to rely on. So there's other tips and tricks I think you can employ there. But figuring out what to say in a design review or any kind of conversation or meeting is all about understanding who you're talking to. What do they already know about the project? I think one common trap that a lot of designers fall into is too much context, too much backstory. A really common thing is if you get people cutting you off in the middle of your narrative and saying things like, yeah, I get it, let's move on to this other thing, or like that's a sign that you're giving too much context. But anyway, you really have to know your audience. And this is something that we get better at over time. And obviously, if you're working with the same people over and over again, you're going to learn a little bit more every time you present to them or talk to them or whatever you're doing. But that's where you start. Who am I talking to? What's the overall project story and context? What do they already know? Where are we? What do they need to know? What's the bare minimum they really need to know to understand what I'm about to show them or talk about? That's how you go about determining what to do and what to say.
I interviewed on my other podcast a couple years back this guy about presenting, how to present to. What topic came up of executives. And we talked about a similar thing. It was like, how do you get to know these people? Because a lot of them, they're so fancy, corner office, you never get to see them. There's gatekeepers all around keeping you from them. And they gave this advice, and I was like, this is a brilliant piece of advice. Talk to their executive assistant, which I just blew my mind. Like, I never thought of that. But basically, pinging a lot of these executives, they have assistants that schedule stuff for them. You ever want to schedule a meeting with them, you go through their assistant. That's the kind of person that would know, what do they like? What do they not like? What kind of things do they hear often? If I were to present this, do you think this would be too much, too little? And those people know them really well, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And I just that was like, I never thought of that. That was just something, I don't know if you've ever heard that advice before, but I just that's brilliant.
It makes sense. I've never heard that advice. I've never tried that. I'm thinking some of the executives I've worked with don't just have an assistant. They have a team of assistants, which is a crazy thing. We're all very busy. And I'm imagining if I tried to approach them and be like, hey, tell me about the CEO, they'd be like, I don't have time for you, dude. Get out
although it's CEO, so, I guess you're right. Yeah, that's different, but yeah.
But no, it is a good idea. I have found that in those situations where there is an executive that is many levels above wherever you're sitting in the organization. If typically it's a bigger company, if it's an organization like that, and chances are you're not going to just go to your meeting with the CEO. There's going to be a bunch of pre-reviews before with people who do know the CEO, with people who have presented to them many times that you can get feedback from. There are other stakeholders that might be more peers with us that have presented to this person or these people before. And I think really networking with those people is a great way to build audience insight if you're presenting to someone new. What kind of presentations work? What doesn't work? What kind of questions are they going to ask? What do they care about? What do they not care about? That's what I've always done in the past to learn about people that I've never met before or never worked with before.
And now your point about multiple executive assistants with teams, I honestly never thought of that.
Yeah.
I know the executives that I'm familiar with, they have one person, but I don't know. Amazon, I imagine these people they've got a lot of executives, assistants and stuff. That's a really great point. And again, it's all about, the context. Like if that's the right decision for you to go talk to the executive assistant, do it. But if you think it's probably, if your gut tells you that's probably going to come across as wasting someone's time, then go a different route. But the interesting thing too here is, and this is what I think about, people get, I think it was on LinkedIn you mentioned about having these fears, you get these random fears. By the way, did you look at that video I posted about George Bush throwing up on the Japanese prime minister?
No,
it's on YouTube. Yeah, it's on YouTube.
Oh, no way. I didn't, I'm definitely watching. I didn't know that.
Actually, that brings up a really good question I want to make sure I'm asking about. But these fears, and one of the things to keep in mind is that nobody on the executive team or anyone internally, at least for the most part, is out to get you. No one's going to find a gotcha. No one's there to make you look stupid. right? The whole point is to help the company, and everyone is there to help the team. So, approaching those other team members and saying, I'm trying to do this thing is really great. I need your help getting it approved. What's some advice? I have a hard time thinking someone's gonna be like, get lost, get the hell out of here. I don't have time for you. Maybe some people would, but finding the right people, maybe, you talked about executive CEO being 7 or 8 levels up.
Yeah.
Find someone 4 levels up, and maybe they know someone 2 levels above them. And you can kind of network, and that internal networking piece, man, is so important for this. I've talked in the past about that idea of social capital. And this again is just when and why that's so important. Because it's not about just meeting people and shooting the shit. It's about meeting people, shooting the shit, getting to know them well, so that when you have a meeting like this, you can go to them and they can give you valid input, and they know you and they trust you, and they're happy to give you honest advice.
Yeah, that's a great point. Relationships matter.
Relationships, man. I'm telling you, you can't build great software without great relationships. But anyway, so one of the things, this is something that I actually meant to ask you, and you just posted this on LinkedIn. It didn't get in our little show notes outline, but this idea of having these sort of irrational fears. And you mentioned, I think it was on LinkedIn, you mentioned, I've always had these fears, but they've never come true.
Yeah.
Right. I'm curious about this. Any tips or any advice for people that might be very nervous getting in front of people and talking?
Yeah. This is something that I personally have struggled with my whole life, my whole career. I still struggle with it. I am, I'm terrified of public speaking.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about this when we did the first podcast. I was just like, I am so scared and terrified of this. And you did a brilliant job of coaching me through it, and everything.
We're just two dudes talking, man. That's it. Two dudes talking. That's it.
But yeah, this is something that I have struggled with, and I think I probably always will. So I can talk about what works for me. And another thing is I've found that I kind of go through different seasons of this throughout my career. I've gone from phases of my career where I was very nervous in the service and lots of anxiety and fear. And then I'll have a run of a couple years where I'm feeling more confident. And then I go back to, wow, I'm having all this anxiety all of a sudden. What's going on? So it kind of comes in waves for me, at least. But I think the thing that really helps me is 2 things. One is to deconstruct what's going on. It's like, okay, I am having anxiety. What am I afraid of? And then just the act of repeating my own fears back to myself or writing them down helps too. It helps me have a laugh about it and go, okay, you're worried that you are going to pass out, barf, have a seizure, that you're going to wake up through a room full of people pointing and laughing at you, and then you're going to get fired. And I'm just like, okay, that's a tad bit irrational. So just identifying that there's fear or anxiety or whatever it is and deconstructing it helps me. And then you can go past that and go, okay, what if that did happen? What would I do? And then you start understanding that if I woke up, if I became conscious to a room full of people ridiculing me and then firing me, what would I actually do? And then I know what I would do. I know how to go out there and find work, find jobs. I know what I would do next. And so like playing out the fear, maybe laughing at it if that's relevant. And then, going a step further and going, okay, well, if that did happen, what would I do? Understanding that you're going to survive, that you can get through it, even if the worst happens. That's one thing that has really helped me. The other thing that really helps me is practice. And this is different. Like for the day-to-day stakeholder meeting, I found that that's one of those things where you just get better at that. You don't need to practice. You can quickly come up with a story 5 minutes before the meeting after you do it enough times. It's a little bit different if you are doing some things that can be really anxiety-inducing, like the in-person portfolio presentation. You're speaking in front of a room full of people for whatever reason. So for many people, practicing and rehearsing in front of other people first really helps. This is interesting, though, because it's another thing, like everything else we're talking about is very nuanced. I've also met designers who were great at presenting, who actually don't ever rehearse because it makes it harder for them. because then the
Really?
anxiety becomes, am I
Oh, yeah.
saying the right thing? Am I following the script?
Yeah.
So it makes it worse.
Yeah.
And so you've really got to figure out what works for you and what
works for you,
doesn't.
yeah.
And, just keep doing it, trying new things. And I think it's one of those things that gets a little bit better over time. And if it doesn't, if you're like me and it doesn't get better, or sometimes it gets better, but then you revert, then you have a set of tools and tricks that, you can rely on.
And I know we're not talking about presenting and stuff necessarily, but I think obviously storytelling goes hand in hand with presenting, I think. One of the things that I like to do is, NFL teams, for instance, they play a football game, they record it, then they go back in the locker room and they watch the tapes. They see what they did well. They see what they didn't do well. How can they improve for next time? And one of the things I really like to do is record myself doing it, as if I'm, especially presenting remotely now, it's almost exactly what people would be seeing. And I listen to it back. Did that thing really make sense? Was that as interesting as I thought in my head? Did I say it the right way? Should I have said it a different way? And it's interesting because I've talked to people, though, I've suggested to them, like, I cannot listen back to my voice. I can't watch myself, So, again, what's right for you, what works for you? Some people, this might make them terrified and give them anxiety for years to come. But, that's something I really like to do is record something, especially when I'm presenting, and listen back and say, like, did that work? Did that sound right? Did I say that weird? Did I, should I reword this? That helps me. I don't know. Some people, again, I know a lot of people don't like to hear their own voice, and that makes them really nervous. But that's something that I like to do.
That's a good one. I've done that too, and that has helped me. Yeah.
Watch the tapes. All right. The last question I'm kind of curious about, is this idea. A lot of people are worried as designers, we need to be original and be creative and be unique. Is there anything you have any tips or anything about finding your unique voice here? Or do you think that even matters? Is that something that really changes the outcome?
Yeah, I think so. I think I don't know if there's a specific recipe to doing this. I think that it's another thing that's nuanced, and you've got to find what works for you. The way I've always gone about this is just paying attention to what's going on around me. If you're working on a team of designers and you notice people doing it very, like presenting or communicating or storytelling or whatever it is, in a particularly effective way, pay attention to what they're doing and then start grabbing the pieces that work for you and kind of put your own spin on it. Ultimately, like, the word storytelling is really interesting because if you feel like sometimes people think that it's not authentic, like, oh, what kind of story is this guy telling me? You've got to, I don't know if believe is the right word, but you've got to be into it. It's got to be your voice for it to really, for your message to get delivered. So you've got to do it in your own way that works for you, that is, meshes well with your own personality and communication style. You can't really just steal it unless, you find an example that is exactly you and your voice and your personality, and it's going to work for you and you're comfortable doing. So I think it's really observing what's going on around you and then borrowing the pieces that work and putting your own spin on it and again, trying different things and seeing what works and what doesn't and kind of going from there.
Yeah, I often use this sort of example with, visual design, but I think it works for storytelling as well. Like if you think about, artists, classically trained artists, at least, I don't know, 100, 200 years ago, maybe they still do it in universities, I'm not sure. But when they learn, they copy, right? They go and they take like Leonardo da Vinci or something and they look at the brushstrokes and they understand, like, how did he move his brush? How did he do this? What, not just that, but why it worked so well. And not copying for the sake of copying, but copying for the sake of understanding how it was done and what was most effective about it. And you mentioned this before, but going and listening to TED Talks or something like that, I know we're not talking about presenting necessarily, but finding those examples that work really well and figuring out what part of that works for you and what doesn't work for you, because some of it might not. How do they speak? When do they pause? When do they take a breath? How do they, increase or decrease the tone or the volume or high pitch, low pitch, whatever, all those various things have an impact on your audience. It's not always just the words coming out of your mouth. It's also how you say the words that can have an impact and be compelling. And, finding those examples of whatever works and what doesn't, and then copying them for a little bit if you want to, and then slowly over time, changing it to fit your specific needs. That's something, again, this is sort of presenting, not necessarily telling stories, but, examples of stories too. I mean, that could be something too. The framework, what works for you, what doesn't, So that's something that I kind of tell people a lot too, is sort of copy, steal like an artist, copy for a little bit, and then figure out what works, and then create your own voice from that hodgepodge of examples to create something unique and different for you.
Yeah, makes total sense.
All right. So Jeff, I want to hear more. Tell us more about your storytelling guide, your course, your newsletter, and all that stuff. What can people expect to learn if they were to sign up for your course?
Sure. So I think one of the reasons I started doing all this is that I thought that there was a lack of really like practical, specific articles, resources that show people how they can actually do this stuff in their day-to-day work. And I'm trying to address that with all of the stuff I have out there. So the ebook, the storytelling guide, is aimed at really practical, specific advice you can really use in your day-to-day. The newsletter is the same thing. I would describe it as a weekly-ish newsletter that comes out that attacks a specific problem with real examples and shows you how to actually do stuff. Instead of some of the more like heady conceptual storytelling kind of rah-rah stuff that we typically see out there. There's a lot of heady stuff about storytelling, but not much specific guidance on how to actually do it. That's what all my resources are trying to address. So that's what the book is about. That's what the newsletter is about. That's what the course is about too. It's about pragmatic, practical things you can use and with real examples. And hopefully it's helping people. So
yeah, absolutely. And where can we find it?
uxstorytelling.io.
Yeah, you're right.
And uxstorytelling.io/course is where you can find the course. And then on my LinkedIn profile as well.
And I was also going to mention, you post several times a week, 3, 4, 5 times a week, a lot about storytelling, but also other stuff too. Really great insights there. So if you're on LinkedIn, find my man, Jeff, and give him a little, smash that bell, as they say up at the top. Right?
Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, right on, man. All right. So Jeff, the last time we were here, I put you on the spot. I had some questions for you, and I put you on the spot, and I found out afterwards that you really don't like being put on the spot. So I thought, let's give Jeff a second chance. I sent him the questions ahead of time so he could come up with some answers. And this time we're going to go through the same questions, but you had some time to think about it this time. And I'm going to see how different. I'm going to go back and compare and contrast and see how what these answers were like from a few months back. Are you ready?
I'm ready. And I before we begin, I so appreciate you catering to my specific needs. Thank you very much.
I'm all about the guests here on Beyond UX Design. It's not about me. It's about you guys. I wouldn't have a show without y'all. All right. First up, what's your favorite non-design book?
Okay. I have an answer.
Let me hear it.
And this is interesting because you and I have chatted about how hard it is to find time to read books.
Yes.
And you and I are both parents. There's families and stuff involved, and it's hard to find time for that. So, and we already know and have previously established how ridiculously terrible I am at choosing favorites about stuff. So I'm going to talk about the last book that's not a design book that I remember reading that I really got into. And that is the Wool trilogy by Hugh Howey.
Okay. Tell me about it.
Have you heard of this? You're kind of a sci-fi guy. Okay.
I haven't.
This would be a good one to check out. So it's 3 books. The first one was written in, I think, 2012. This is a post-apocalyptic scenario about
I love those,
a community of people who live underground in a giant silo.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And then this really compelling story unfolds about how they got there and why they live underground in this silo.
Oh, fascinating.
There's a lot of cool, like techie kind of sci-fi stuff about how they survive underground.
I love it.
But it's a really great story. There are versions of the book that you can, if you use like a Kindle app or some sort of e-reader, that are kind of like graphic novels with animated visuals and stuff.
Ooh, I love that.
But it's just like I cruised through these 3 books in like 2 or 3 weeks, and this was at a time when I had in the phase of my life where I had almost no time. I think our daughter was like 3 or 4 months old. And like as soon as bedtime happened or there was some sleep, I just rushed to the couch, got out the Kindle app, and just spent as much time reading these books as I could. So they're great.
Yeah, those are the best books, man. Like just like kind of clear your head. Nothing. I don't want to think about stuff. I just want some like, just some non-educational stuff. Was it The Well? W-E-L-L?
Sorry, wool, like wool, like a sheep's wool.
Oh, I was thinking well, like it was in
sweater.
Okay.
No.
All right, I was thinking you said well, like a silo in the ground. Anyway, all right, The Wool. All right.
The Wool trilogy, yeah.
I'm going to check that out. Right on. And are there more books to come, or is this just the 3?
The 3 is out, and I think Apple TV is turning this into either a movie or a series right now. I think it's on the verge of coming out, if this sounds familiar.
All right.
But I'm super excited to watch.
I love that stuff, man. I eat that stuff up. Anything like zombie related, post-apocalypse, like
You're into
aliens attacking. I love that stuff, dude.
Yeah?
It's funny. There was what was the show? There was a show. I think it was like a TBS show where it was about like aliens invade and like they destroy the planet basically. And they were filming it. This was like right after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans when like pretty much everything was like devastated. But they filmed. It's kind of sad, but they filmed it all there in New Orleans, outside of New Orleans, because it looked like aliens destroyed the city. Anyway, that I love that kind of stuff. Though we were just watching that recently. It's on Netflix, but I love that. I eat that stuff up. All right, next question. What is your favorite non-design podcast?
Okay, this one, hopefully people get as much of a kick out of this as I did. This is a completely bizarre and delightful podcast that I don't think is very well known called Frog of the Week.
Frog of the Week. Okay.
Yes.
I'm writing this stuff down.
It is,
every week they have a different frog or something?
That's exactly what it is. It's true to its name. Every episode is super short. It's 4 minutes or less. And it is great. It is this this person, the host of the podcast just speaks in this like very slow, zen, methodical way about a different species of frog and tells you all about this frog. There's strange music going on in the background. And it's like, if you're ever in a headspace where you're just like, this is all too much, I just need some quick reset. I need to think about something else. I need to get a smile on my face and have a laugh. This is a good way to do it.
Oh, I love it.
Frog of the Week. That's my reco.
The first thing I thought of was it Joseph Attenborough? Is it Daniel Attenborough? What's his name? Something Attenborough.
David,
David Attenborough. That's it. With the British nature guy. I don't know why I just thought of that. Is it similar to that? Like where you just sort of this is the frog of blah blah, and
it is similar. You're right. It's funny you brought that up. This is my wife's favorite trick for falling asleep. She has trouble sleeping, and she goes for David Attenborough. And
right on.
It works like a charm for her.
Relaxing, man. Oh yeah. I just. You like put that audiobook on or audio thing or just, I guess, play it on your phone, I guess.
Yeah.
I love it. I'm going to try that next time. I usually put on like beach sounds, but I think David Attenborough might be a better way. I'm willing to bet someone's put together like a David Attenborough sleep playlist on Spotify. I'm going to like look for that.
If not, you've got the skills to make it, man.
That's an opportunity. Licensing fees might be a big thing. Whatever. Anyway. All right. What is your favorite meal?
Okay, so for this one, and I remember talking about this with you last time, I couldn't name a favorite meal, but I could remember places I'd been where I've had memorable meals that were associated with travel. So this time, I think
you mentioned the street food in Singapore, right?
Street food and Malaysia.
Malaysia.
In Singapore, there was a great meal. In Italy, there was in a little neighborhood sit-down place. That was super memorable. I think another thing that I go to is like very simple, easy to make, kind of comfort foods. And I think one of my favorites of those is pasta, any kind of pasta, but pasta with butter, cheese, and a lot of crushed red pepper.
Ooh.
Is super simple and completely delicious if you've got like a good cheese and some spicy stuff and butter.
I love it. Dude, I love, crushed red pepper and Italian food and stuff, pasta. I love that, man. I do that too. And my kids are like, yeah, it's spicy. I don't know. I always put a little like crushed red pepper in my tomato sauce when I make, but
sure.
I'm a weirdo, I guess. Maybe I'm not that weird. I don't know.
You're not that weird. You're totally fine. That's a good one for families because, like my kids will eat just simple pasta noodles with butter and like something else. And then the adults can like throw in the extra stuff and it works for them too. Yeah. So it's a good one that I eat a lot.
My kids never like what I cook. And I cook like every night, and every night I get they do like this thing where they'll do like thumbs up or thumbs down, but often they just do a sideways thumb. And it's like, it's not terrible, but it's not great. I'm like, you
mess.
You son of a, you ungrateful little shits.
Yeah. You know what? Sometimes I feel like it'd be, instead of actually buying food and trying to feed it to my children, it might be more fun and entertaining to just take some of our cash and set it on fire. And like the result would be the same. Nobody would eat anything, but you might get a little more entertainment out of it and less arguing. It's
fun to watch. Look at all that money burning up. It's a fun life lesson for the kids. You see that? That's all the money I wasted on your food last week. And guess what? This week, I'm not even buying you food. Yeah, my kids, they constantly complain. And like, it's funny. All the junior designers don't have kids. They probably couldn't care less about this.
Yeah.
But they like refuse to go to the store with me. They hate going to the grocery store.
Really?
And then when I get home, they're like, well, why didn't you buy this? Why didn't you buy that? I'm like, because you didn't go to the store with me and tell me that you wanted it. That's why. You want to come to the store with me? You go to the store, I'll buy whatever you want. Anyway, then they complain about like dinner and stuff. Anyway, my kids are like, if I ask them what to cook for dinner every night, it'd be ravioli or meatballs.
Yeah.
That's all they want to eat. And I'm like, guys, I'm sick of eating ravioli and meatballs. I love ravioli and meatballs as much as the next person, but let's do something else.
Yeah. Mix it up.
Right. Mix it up. All right. What's your favorite vacation spot?
Okay, so last time, I don't have a new and interesting answer here. Favorite vacation spot. Last time we talked about Hawaii.
Right? Yep.
We also talked about how, like, as you and I have advanced through our lives, our travel preferences have changed,
right. Yep.
especially having families might skew one away from the more adventurous to the more predictable and safe. Hawaii is still that for me right now. We're super lucky and we're able to go with my whole family for Christmas.
Ooh,
and it's just an awesome place, total mental reset. Totally love it. I have talked to some designers who are living in Hawaii, and I continue to be in a jealous rage that they're living in Hawaii.
Oh, I know, man.
This last time was a little bit different. Like we've gone before later on in the winter in Seattle, like February, March, and it's kind of what you need to get you through the rest of the rainy season. This time it was in December, and I actually found it made it harder to come back. It was like,
really?
I've got another 4 months of the rain and the cold. Oh no, why don't I?
Oh, that's right, because you're in Seattle too, and it's like, not sunny at all.
Yeah. So anyway, Hawaii's great.
So let me ask you this: when you're in Hawaii for Christmas, does anyone actually say "Mele Kalikimaka," or is that just a silly Christmas song?
No one said it to us, and that I remember.
So they lied. Was it Bing Crosby, whoever that was? He lied. All right, we'll have to write him. I'll write him a strongly worded letter. What is your favorite design tool that is not Figma?
Okay, so I think
has this one changed?
Last time I said pen and paper, but I think now it's anything you can write with.
Anything, okay.
Yeah, and lately for me, it's been Google Docs or Notion. This is another, we can wrap this back to storytelling. This is a great way to start with figuring out what the story is or what your presentation is to start by writing it down.
Yeah.
Before if it is a presentation, before you get into the visual piece, write down what the narrative structure is. What's going on? What do you want to say? And how are you going to talk about it? Writing really helps you not have too much context, not have too much stuff on slides if you're doing slides. And writing is so relevant to so many different things we do as designers, like planning out strategy, whatever it is, gathering your thoughts. We get carried away in visual stuff as designers, don't we? But taking a step back and writing stuff down is a good idea a lot.
Let me ask you this. I have just started using Notion, actually, not for work, but just personal stuff. And what I'm really digging all the various ways you can lay things out and the templates and stuff that you can get and add on. Have you figured out any unique ways to use Notion, or are you just using it as like a text editor?
No, I'm very basic with my Notion skills right now.
Okay.
I have very remedial Notion chops.
Okay.
I usually, this is one area that I can improve, but I very quickly give up on new things if it's taking any amount of time. And I very quickly revert back to the fast thing I know instead of learning the new thing that could save me a lot of time. You know what I mean?
I love it. Yeah.
And that's where I'm at with Notion. So I'll crack open a cool template and then it's like, oh, I've got to spend 20 minutes figuring out how to use this. Nope, I'm out. I'm going to go back to the thing because I'm feeling crunched for time. So I can improve there. But
the reason why I ask is I'm the same way. Like I haven't figured out any really cool ways to use Notion, but I see all these people selling all these really cool templates and doing all this cool stuff. And I'm like, I'm just typing stuff. Like, I don't know. I feel like I'm not as like creative as some of these other people that are doing it, but I was just curious. I'm glad I'm not alone.
You're not alone.
Okay, good.
I'm with you.
All right. Well, that is it, Jeff. That's all I got for today. One more time before we get out of here, where can we find all your great work?
uxstorytelling.io/course is where the new course is, and everything else is at uxstorytelling.io.
That is it, Jeff. That is it. Thank you again for coming on, man. I think all this stuff, all the storytelling techniques and tips and tricks and everything we talked about today, I'm confident this is going to be super helpful for everybody out there. So thank you again for sharing your insights. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate you and what you're doing, and thank you for having me back.
Absolutely, man. Well, all right, y'all, that's it for us for today. I hope Jeff and I helped to shed a little bit of light on storytelling and demystify this word, storytelling. I'm curious, what has your experience been like with storytelling in UX? Do you feel like it's helped you? Have you won over any difficult stakeholders or other people in your team by telling compelling stories? Let me know what you think on LinkedIn or shoot me an email at hello@beyonduxdesign.com. I'd love to hear from you. And if you like what you heard today, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel like you're getting something out of the show, I would really appreciate it if you left a 5-star review. That would help me out so much more than you can imagine. And if you know anybody who might find any of this stuff useful, why don't you tell them about it? That would be fantastic. And if you want to help keep the show independent and ad-free, check out all those Patreon sponsorship packages at beyonduxdesign.com/support. You can join Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, and Kevin by supporting the show for as little as $3 a month. And there are some awesome perks like that badass holographic Beyond UX Design sticker. You can get a shout on the show every week. There's even a package to meet with me for 30 minutes every month, but I only have 2 of those left, so act now. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/audible trial to download The Science of Storytelling by Will Storr. Sign up for a 30-day Audible trial. Cancel at any time, and the book is yours to keep forever. And in case you forgot, I've partnered with audible.com, so anytime you sign up for a free trial, you'll help support the show. There's no obligation, and you can cancel anytime, and the audiobook is yours to keep forever. So get a free audiobook on me and help support the show. Remember, sign up for the newsletter and check out all the past episodes, along with all the show notes at beyonduxdesign.com. I hope you keep coming back for more great UX tips from Beyond UX Design. And until next time, remember, you're more than a designer because there's more to UX than design. I'll see you around. Take care, y'all.
And then you still promise that if it sucks, you won't use it.
Exactly. I haven't told anybody that we're meeting again, so there's no expectations here. And if it sucks, no one will hear it.